911, emergency. We need police. What's going on there, ma'am? We have a kidnapping. All right, please explain to me what's going on. Okay, there's a note left, and our daughter's gone. A note was left, and your daughter is gone. How old is your daughter? 6 years old. She's gone. 6 years old. The couple was never charged, but early on there was a police theory that Patsy Ramsey may have killed her daughter in a fit of rage over bedwetting and then covered it up. Finding the killer isn't going to change my life at this point, but it will change the lives of my children and my grandchildren. This cloud needs to be removed from our family's head and this chapter closed for their benefit. So there is an answer. If our DNA matched anything significant, they would have arrested us in a New York minute. I don't give up how scientific it is. Go back to the damn drawing board. It's not the same without her. Why is it so hard for people to understand that we love this child with everything in our being? We would never touch a hair on the head of one of our children. I mean, it just is inconceivable to me. We could find the killer tomorrow. He could be arrested, convicted, and, jailed. And there'd still be 20% of the population would think that we had something to do with it. Did your daughter have a bedwetting incident that night? Did you get up? Did you get angry? And did you hurt her? No, I did not. What is your reaction when you know many people think that's what you did? They are wrong. I don't know what else to say. How else do you say no except no? No means no. Today's date is June 23rd, 1998. June 1998, Broomfield Police Department. Right at the time was approximately 9:04. A year and a half after JonBenét was murdered, John and Patsy Ramsey, sitting in separate rooms at the same time, were questioned by Boulder authorities in a Colorado police station. These tapes have never before been seen publicly. There's been a lot of speculation by a lot of people that maybe you didn't know anything about the murder, but maybe Patsy did. Questioning John is Lou Smith, a homicide detective then working for the Boulder DA's office. It's preposterous. I mean, Patsy loves both her children dearly, but frankly, she and Jane were extremely close. A Christmas morning photo of the kids. Detective Tom Haney questioned Patsy, who at the time was taking medication for both anxiety and depression. If I told you right now that we have trace evidence that appears to link you to the death of JonBenét, what would you tell me? Totally impossible. Joey, how is it impossible? I did not kill my child. I didn't have a thing to do with it. And I'm not talking, somebody's guess or some rumor or some story. I don't care what you're talking about. I'm talking about scientific evidence. I don't give a flying flip how scientific it is. Go back to the damn drawing board. I didn't do it. John Ramsey didn't do it, and we didn't have a clue of anybody who did do it. So, we all got to start working together from here this day forward to try to find out who the hell did it. When people look back at this case, they often say the body told one story, the house another, but the note screamed for attention. 3 pages long, nearly 400 words, written carefully on paper torn from a pad inside the Ramsey residence. In most kidnappings, ransom notes are short, urgent, rushed. This one felt different. It was theatrical. It was as though someone wanted every line to be read not just by the parents, but by detectives, journalists, and eventually the entire nation. The decision to use the family's own stationery was already strange. It tied the writer directly to the house. No intruder with a functioning plan would linger to find a pen and notepad, sit down, and compose a letter of that length. That act alone suggested calculation. Whoever wrote it had time, privacy, and confidence that they wouldn't be interrupted. Handwriting experts were called immediately, and their conclusions fractured the investigation. Some examiners highlighted striking similarities between the script and that of Patsy Ramsey. They pointed to the way capital letters were formed, her particular R that leaned forward, or the peculiar loops in her D. Others countered that handwriting cannot be reduced to isolated letters. It's a flowing system. They noted inconsistencies in slant, pressure, and spacing that argued against her authorship. The disagreement became so sharp that experts were publicly discrediting each other. Decades later, the debate has never been fully resolved.
What has changed, however, is the technology used to study writing. Today, software can measure the pressure applied at microscopic levels, the rhythm of strokes, and the mathematical probability that two samples share an author. Some private labs have quietly run the note through these programs. Their preliminary findings suggest the script cannot be conclusively linked to Patsy or any member of the family. Though the pattern still raises questions, the possibility remains that new AI-driven handwriting systems could settle what human experts could not. Beyond the visual form of the letters, the actual language of the note continues to baffle linguists. The writer described themselves as part of a small foreign faction, a phrase that doesn't fit natural English usage. It feels contrived, almost cartoonish, as if the author wanted to sound international but failed to replicate authentic speech. Then there are echoes of popular films. If you want her to see 1997 and don't try to grow a brain, mirror lines from movies like Dirty Harry and Speed. To investigators, this raised a chilling possibility that the note was never meant to be a real demand for money. It was performance art, a collage of phrases lifted from pop culture to disguise the writer's true intent. The ransom amount was just as suspicious. $118,000 is an oddly specific figure, not $500,000, not around $250,000, but the exact amount of John Ramsey's annual bonus that year. That detail made investigators lean hard toward an inside job. Who else would know such a private number? Was the writer trying to frame him? Or was it an unconscious leak of knowledge only the household possessed? Every sentence of the note has been pulled apart under forensic linguistics. Experts studied sentence length, vocabulary level, and punctuation. Some believe the note reflects the education of a college-educated native English speaker.
Possibly someone in their 30s or 40s, given the cultural references. Others think the awkward phrasing suggests deliberate disguise of an author trying to fake mistakes to appear less educated. Still others propose two writers, or at least a rough draft polished into the final 3 pages. Then there's the emotional tone. Real ransom notes usually carry one clear message: we have your child. Pay the money, follow instructions. Here, the writer drifted into personal insults, mocking John Ramsey, taunting his professional achievements and hinting at surveillance. We respect your business, but not the country it serves. Those lines sounded less like a kidnapper and more like someone staging a political motive. The over-explanation hinted not at urgency, but at theater, at someone desperate to mislead. Physically, the note is also rich with clues. The paper came from a pad in the Ramsey kitchen. Torn edges suggest multiple sheets were used before the final draft. Investigators found practice notes, abandoned attempts at forming the message. That meant the writer was sitting comfortably inside the house, rewriting until satisfied. This is not behavior consistent with a burglar improvising under pressure. The pen used was also from the home. It bore traces of ink consistent with the letter's color and flow. Forensic scientists in the late 1990s had limited tools to determine ink age. Today, techniques exist that can identify the chemical composition, date of manufacture, even the batch number from which the ink originated. If retested now, the pen might reveal new information, including microscopic residues that could hold skin cells or sweat particles invisible to the first examiners. Another underexplored avenue is the possibility of touch DNA on the note itself. In the 1990s, this technology was not available. Swabbing the margins, the back of the pages, or even the adhesive fibers from the pad could yield trace biological material. A single partial profile could, with genetic genealogy, be cross-referenced against massive family tree databases to point investigators toward a surname, a bloodline, or even a specific living individual. The note may yet speak again if tested under 21st century conditions. The structure of the document also raises questions. It begins formally, addressing John by name, instructing him to follow orders. But by the second page, the writer rambles. Instructions contradict each other. Threats are repeated unnecessarily. Some scholars argue this shift indicates stress. The author began with a plan but lost control, falling into improvisation. Others argue the opposite.
that it was intentional chaos designed to confuse. Either way, the tone betrays more about the writer's mind than about any genuine ransom plan. Investigators have also studied the psychology of the note. A person willing to sit in a family's kitchen and compose 3 pages is not motivated by quick money. They are driven by control, by narrative. They wanted to manipulate how the crime would be interpreted. By planting phrases about factions, surveillance, and foreign power, they shifted suspicion outward. By using an exact bonus figure, they directed suspicion inward. It was a double-layered trap, crafted to confuse both law enforcement and public opinion. Over time, the ransom note has become more than just a piece of evidence. It has become a character in the story, quoted, analyzed, reenacted in documentaries. Some argue that its very existence shows the crime was staged from the start. Others maintain that while the note may have been a cover, the DNA evidence points elsewhere. Regardless, the note remains the single longest communication ever left at a modern American crime scene, a fact that underlines just how strange this case truly is. What makes the document so haunting today is the possibility that it still holds unmined clues. Tiny chemical signatures, overlooked indentations, invisible biological traces, all may still be hiding in its fibers. As technology advances, what was once dismissed as dead evidence could transform into the key that breaks the case wide open. And that leads us directly into the next layer of proof, the genetic material that investigators did recover. A microscopic signature that both exonerated the family and kept the mystery alive. Because if the ransom note raised questions about authorship, the DNA evidence raised an even bigger one. Whose invisible presence was left behind on JonBenét's body? When the pages of the ransom note were finally sealed into evidence bags, investigators turned to the other silent witness in the house, the biological traces that science promised would one day speak. Unlike the handwritten letter, which could be argued and interpreted from every angle, DNA seemed immutable. It was chemistry, not opinion. But what was first considered the golden ticket to the truth soon became another puzzle, opening as many doors as it closed. In the earliest days, technicians worked with what they had: nail scrapings, fabric swabs, and hair samples. Under JonBenét's nails, scientists found tiny fragments of male genetic material. Another trace appeared on her underwear. These discoveries electrified the case. Detectives believed they had the killer's signature, a profile that could be matched if the right suspect came along. The FBI's combined DNA index system, CODIS, was still in its early years. But even then, a foreign profile not belonging to the family or anyone in the household meant one thing: an outsider had been present. Law enforcement quietly began collecting samples from neighbors, acquaintances, and known offenders in Colorado. More than 200 individuals eventually had their DNA compared. None matched. This failure to identify a suspect didn't weaken the value of the evidence. Instead, it hardened the split between two camps. Police officers leaning toward a family explanation saw the results as inconclusive, possibly the byproduct of contamination. Prosecutors leaned to consider an intruder theory, clung to the data as proof that someone else had entered the house.
Science, rather than resolving the argument, had deepened it. A decade later, technology took a leap forward. By 2008, laboratories could analyze touch DNA, skin cells left behind when someone handles fabric. Colorado authorities ordered a re-examination of the evidence. Technicians applied these new methods to JonBenét's clothing, amplifying the genetic signals that older tests had missed. The results shook the case to its core. The DNA profile that appeared matched neither John, nor Patsy, nor Burke. The entire immediate family was officially ruled out as contributors. District Attorney Mary Lacey went further. She'd issued a public letter exonerating the Ramseys. In the eyes of her office, they were cleared by science. For the first time in 12 years, the family had an official statement proclaiming their innocence. For many Americans, though, the announcement landed like a thunderclap. If the family didn't do it, who did, and why had no match surfaced in any database?
Not everyone accepted the results without skepticism. Forensic scientists know that garments, especially children's clothing, can carry genetic traces from manufacturing and packaging. A single factory worker's cells can ride along fibers, surviving washing machines, even years in a closet. Critics argued that the unknown male profile might have been deposited long before the night of the crime. Others questioned laboratory procedures. Were the swabs handled correctly? Were the amplification methods in 2008 too sensitive, pulling in background noise mistaken for a true profile? The Colorado Bureau of Investigation insisted their work met standards, but in the court of public opinion, doubts lingered. Even within law enforcement, the divide remained. Some detectives continued to believe that the DNA was incidental, real, but irrelevant to the act itself. Others believed it was the single most important clue ever recovered in the case. The truth, as always, seemed buried in layers of possibility. The story didn't end in 2008. Technology kept advancing. By the 2020s, whole genome sequencing became routine in major labs. Instead of reading a few markers, scientists could map nearly the entire genetic code from even the smallest fragment. That meant more accuracy, stronger matches, and the ability to cross-check against vast genealogical databases. Investigators began using this method in other cold cases with spectacular success. Decades-old crimes in California, Oregon, and beyond were solved when partial DNA was uploaded to genealogy websites tracing distant relatives who eventually led back to the perpetrator. This new era of forensic genealogy offered what the Ramsey case had lacked for decades, a path forward. Yet, as of 2025, Boulder police have not publicly confirmed whether JonBenét's DNA evidence has been fully sequenced or uploaded. Pressure has mounted from both the family and the public. John Ramsey himself has repeatedly urged authorities to hand over the material to private experts who could run the profiles through modern genealogical systems. His argument is simple. The answer may already exist, waiting in a family tree somewhere in America, even with new technology. One central debate remains. Was the DNA from the killer, or was it incidental contact? If it truly came from a factory worker or casual contamination, then genealogy searches could send investigators chasing ghosts. But if it came from the person who left JonBenét in the basement, then it represents the most direct link to the truth. Linguistic analysis of the ransom note pointed to someone deliberate, possibly rehearsed. The DNA tells a different story. Messy, unintended, a trace left without planning. The intersection of those two elements, deliberate writing, accidental genetic presence, has fueled endless speculation. Was the note a cover by a family member while an outsider left DNA during the act? Or was the DNA itself simply a red herring, noise from the background of modern life? Forensic specialists argue both sides. Supporters of the intruder theory highlight the impossibility of factory contamination on multiple sites, under nails, on underwear, on long-preserved samples. Skeptics counter that the amount of material was too minimal to be conclusive, pointing out that such traces can transfer invisibly through laundry handling or shared objects. If the profile were uploaded today to databases like GDmatch or Family Tree DNA, it could generate familial hits, relatives who share enough to place the unknown male within a branch of a family tree. Investigators could then build backward, mapping connections until a suspect emerged. This method has already solved cases older than JonBenét's. The potential obstacles, however, are significant. Privacy laws in Colorado restrict the release of sensitive genetic data. Law enforcement must balance investigative necessity against civil liberties. Some agencies remain hesitant, fearing lawsuits or political backlash. Meanwhile, families of victims argue that every possible tool should be deployed. If Boulder police take that step, the consequences could be immediate. A viable match could place the investigation into active status within weeks. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, the community might see a name rather than a shadow. But if the search comes back empty, it could reinforce the contamination theory, suggesting the unknown male never set foot in the Ramsey home. DNA has always carried an aura of certainty. In television dramas, a single hair leads straight to the culprit. In real life, it's rarely that simple. The Ramsey case is a testament to both the power and the limitations of science. The presence of genetic material gave investigators hope, but it also trapped them in years of debate, unable to move forward without consensus. Now, with whole genome sequencing and genealogical mapping, that same fragment could either close the book or leave it open forever. Every advancement increases the stakes. Each year that passes raises the risk that the profile, if genuine, belongs to someone who may no longer be alive, complicating prosecution. Yet, even a posthumous identification would give closure, a name, a history, a story to replace the endless void. The ransom note tried to direct suspicion outward, while the DNA evidence literally pointed outward to someone beyond the family. Both pieces of evidence, when taken together, suggest an author who wanted to manipulate the narrative and a trace of someone physically present. Whether those two align in the same person remains the burning question. And that brings us to the crossroads where the case stands today. Two artifacts, one written, one biological, both capable of leading to the truth. One composed deliberately in ink, the other left involuntarily in cells. Between them lies the possibility of solving America's most haunting cold case. The DNA profile may have been invisible to the naked eye, but scattered across the basement and the body were physical artifacts, objects, impressions, and marks that investigators believed would hold the truth in solid form. These items, unlike the ransom note or the genetic traces, were tangible. They could be weighed, photographed, and bagged.
Yet, over time, each one proved more complicated than expected, raising new questions about intent, staging, and authenticity. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a crude instrument fashioned from a broken paintbrush handle and a length of cord. This makeshift tightening device was looped around JonBenét's neck. The inclusion of a wooden stick as a twisting lever transformed an ordinary cord into something with mechanical advantage, capable of inflicting fatal compression with minimal strength. Investigators debated whether this construction suggested planning or improvisation. Some experts argued that it revealed a calculated offender, someone familiar with methods of restraint and control. Others countered that the device appeared amateurish, as though it had been cobbled together hastily to simulate sophistication. The fact that the stick originated from Patsy Ramsey's own art supplies, snapped from a paintbrush in her kit, tied the object back to the household. This led to speculation that the entire device was staged, a theatrical prop meant to redirect suspicion. Modern forensic examination could push this debate further. Microscopy might reveal whether the break in the paintbrush occurred under pressure consistent with sudden force or deliberate snapping. Residues embedded in the wood could indicate who handled it and when. Advanced chemical analysis could even identify trace paints or varnishes unique to the Ramsey home, distinguishing between pre-existing wear and fresh breakage from that night. A strip of duct tape was recovered from JonBenét's mouth. To investigators, this suggested an attempt to silence or restrain her. Yet the tape carried mysteries of its own. Fibers stuck to the adhesive included strands consistent with the Ramseys' household, but nothing conclusive tied the material to an outsider. Latent fingerprints were reportedly found on the tape, but proved too smudged for identification. Inconsistent handling by first responders further muddied the evidence. Some accounts suggest the tape was removed hastily by a family member before being photographed, raising questions about preservation. Today, adhesive forensics could revisit the sample with tools unavailable in 1996. Raman spectroscopy and gas chromatography could map the chemical fingerprint of the tape's adhesive, identifying the manufacturer and even the batch that could potentially connect it to rolls sold in specific regions at specific times. Likewise, DNA extraction from the adhesive surface might isolate cells left behind when the strip was torn or applied. Even a partial profile could be decisive if run through genealogical mapping. The autopsy documented narrow, deep impressions encircling the neck, consistent with pressure applied by a cord. Early pathologists described them as classic signs of lethal constriction. But decades later, forensic specialists revisited photographs and reports with new techniques. Some argue the depth and angle of the marks suggest the cord was pulled upward, possibly while the child was already unconscious from head trauma. Others interpret the injuries as inconsistent with a practiced offender. The placement appeared uneven, the pressure irregular, implying either a frantic struggle or a staged application. Digital wound pattern analysis software that overlays cord dimensions with skin impressions could provide fresh insight. These programs measure width, angle, and depth more precisely than the human eye.
By applying such models, modern analysts might determine whether the marks came from sustained pressure intended to kill or from post-mortem staging to simulate a violent act. Perhaps the most debated piece of environmental evidence was the basement window. John Ramsey himself admitted to breaking the pane months earlier to gain entry after locking himself out. On the morning JonBenét was found, that same window appeared ajar. Cobwebs on the frame seemed undisturbed, suggesting no one had climbed through recently. Yet some investigators insisted the opening provided a plausible entry and exit route for an intruder. The small grate outside the window showed marks consistent with being lifted, but not definitively. Dust patterns and debris on the sill complicated matters. Some believed they showed disturbance, others saw nothing unusual. Advanced trace analysis today could revisit the site. Soil chemistry could distinguish whether dirt particles on the sill matched the surrounding yard or were transferred from an outside shoe. Laser scanning of the frame could detect microabrasions from recent contact. Even pollen grains trapped in the cracks could reveal seasonal timing of when the window was last moved. Such examinations, unavailable in the 1990s, might finally clarify whether the basement was truly a doorway for the offender or simply a narrative convenience. Investigators noted a partial shoe impression on the basement floor, identified as belonging to a high-tech brand boot. The Ramseys denied owning such footwear. Initially, this clue seemed promising, a footprint left by the intruder, but the significance quickly eroded. The mark was faint, incomplete, and located near high-traffic storage areas. Detectives could not exclude the possibility that it had been left days or weeks earlier by a contractor, visitor, or even a police officer after the crime. For years, the footprint was dismissed as incidental, but modern 3D scanning could bring new clarity.
Even a partial sole impression can reveal size, wear pattern, and depth pressure. By comparing the basement print against historical itch catalogs, analysts might narrow it down to a specific model and production year. Wear analysis could indicate gait or weight of the person who made it. If combined with soil and dust analysis from the groove edges, the timeline of deposition could potentially be reconstructed. Taken individually, each piece of physical evidence raises doubt. The garrote could be either a genuine murder tool or a theatrical stage prop. The duct tape could indicate an attempt to suppress sound or a clumsy afterthought. The compression marks on the neck might reflect genuine lethal force or a staged presentation. The basement window could be a portal or simply an open reminder of an old repair. The high-tech shoe print could belong to a stranger or to someone long forgotten but reanalyzed together under modern forensic conditions. These clues could yield more than the sum of their parts. Trace DNA from adhesive, microabrasions on wood, soil chemistry on windowsills, wear patterns and shoe prints all could converge to paint a clearer picture. In a way, the physical items echo the same tension as the genetic evidence. Both are simultaneously promising and ambiguous. Both have been used to argue competing theories, family staging versus intruder attack, and both now stand ready to be re-examined with 21st century science. Where the DNA gives us the invisible signature of a possible outsider, the physical objects give us the stage props of the crime scene. The unresolved question remains: do they point toward the same individual, or are they contradictory threads woven together in confusion? That uncertainty is why nearly 3 decades later, investigators and the public alike continue to debate every fiber, every mark, every impression in the basement. And as we move from these tangible artifacts to the medical examination itself, we enter the most contested territory of all: the injuries to JonBenét's body, and how pathologists, both then and now, interpret the sequence of events that ended her life. When investigators finished cataloging the physical items in the basement, the gar, the tape, the broken window, they turned to the most difficult piece of evidence: the body itself. Unlike a ransom note or a footprint, the medical findings carried the authority of science. Yet even here, the facts fractured into competing narratives. The official autopsy listed 2 lethal mechanisms: a severe blow to the head and airway compression from a cord. Either injury could have been fatal on its own. The presence of both created confusion that has haunted the case ever since. Pathologists struggled to determine which injury occurred first and whether one was inflicted to mask the other.
The trauma was massive, leaving a wide fracture line consistent with blunt force. But internal bleeding suggested the heart had already slowed when the impact occurred, raising the possibility that compression to the airway came first. Others argued the opposite, that the head injury rendered JonBenét unconscious, after which the cord was applied. The absence of clear brain swelling complicated the sequencing. In modern cold case reviews, specialists emphasize how difficult it is to reconstruct a minute-by-minute order from decades-old photographs and notes. Without lived tissue response data, the timeline remains guesswork. Still, advanced imaging techniques, CT scanning of preserved slides, 3D reconstructions of fracture patterns, could provide new clarity, showing the direction, angle, and timing of the blow with greater precision than in 1996. The debate over sequence matters because it reframes motive. If airway compression came first, it suggests deliberate control, with the head strike as a later staging act. If the blow came first, it could indicate a sudden outburst or accident followed by a cover-up. Some forensic scientists argue the cranial injury appears deeper and more decisive than the ligature marks. To them, the blow incapacitated immediately. The cord was applied afterward, perhaps to simulate a different type of attack. Others argued the opposite, that the depth and uniformity of the cord impressions imply sustained pressure while the heart was still beating, pointing to airway blockage as the true cause. The fight between these camps illustrates how even autopsy findings, often considered the gold standard of truth, are subject to interpretation, especially when revisited decades later under the shadow of competing theories. Beyond the injuries themselves, investigators noted signs that the scene may have been manipulated. The presence of wiping in the intimate area suggested someone attempted to clean or disguise evidence. Combined with the unusual construction of the cord device and the overwritten ransom note, this led some detectives to argue the entire crime had been staged to appear as a kidnapping gone wrong. Pathologists reviewing the wiping detail emphasized that the choice to alter or remove biological traces is itself a behavioral clue. It implies knowledge of forensic risk, an attempt to obstruct detection. This kind of concealment points towards someone familiar with law enforcement procedures, or at least someone who watched enough crime media to fear leaving incriminating material behind. Modern swab analysis could revisit these cleaned areas. Even after wiping, trace residues often persist in absorbent tissue. Mass spectrometry can detect proteins and metabolites at levels invisible to earlier forensic kits. A careful re-examination could reveal whether biological traces were truly removed, or whether minute quantities remain preserved. In recent years, cold case divisions have begun to digitize old autopsy material, scanning every slide and photograph into 3D databases. For JonBenét's case, this means every bruise, every impression, every tissue cross-section can be re-evaluated with software that didn't exist in 1996.
Radiological methods like postmortem CT and MRI can virtually rewind injuries, allowing experts to reconstruct the angle of blows or the mechanics of airway compression. Machine learning models trained on thousands of trauma cases can now compare injury patterns against massive data sets, offering statistical probabilities about cause and sequence. If applied here, these tools could answer lingering questions. Did the head injury precede or follow the cord compression? Were the intimate injuries consistent with chronic harm or with rapid events from that night alone? Was the wiping thorough enough to suggest deliberate staging, or does it reflect something else entirely? What emerges from this modern lens is a portrait not of certainty, but of layered ambiguity. The autopsy, instead of closing the case, became another battlefield of interpretation. Every slide of tissue, every line of the report has been re-examined by generations of pathologists, each convinced of their conclusion, each contradicted by another. For the public, the mention of head trauma, airway compression, and intimate injury turned the case into something darker than a simple homicide. It raised the possibility of long-term harm, of psychological complexity, of someone close to the victim. But because the findings remain contested, they have fueled conspiracy and division rather than resolution. When set beside the garrote, the duct tape, and the shoe print, the autopsy findings create a paradox. The basement artifact suggests staging and confusion. The body suggests deliberate violence, possibly in 2 phases. The forensic record, instead of pointing cleanly to one scenario, reflects a crime entangled in both overplanning and chaos. As we stand nearly 3 decades later, the promise of cold case pathology lies not in producing instant clarity, but in stripping away the noise with next-generation imaging and genetic analysis of tissue. The medical record might finally be able to say what the first examiners could not: in what order events unfolded, whether there was evidence of prolonged harm, and how much of the scene was manipulation rather than genuine assault. The hope is that one day the slides and scans may speak with the same authority people once expected of DNA. And if they do, they could realign the entire interpretation of the Ramsey case, tipping the balance between family suspicion and intruder theory once and for all. The autopsy showed us the body's story. But alongside the physical evidence was another dimension investigators couldn't ignore: how people behaved. Words spoken in panic, phone calls made under stress, neighbors' recollections of sounds and lights. These details form their own kind of forensic trail, and just like the DNA or the ransom note, the behavioral record has been contested, reinterpreted, and weaponized for nearly 3 decades. When Patsy Ramsey dialed 911 at 5:52 a.m. on December 26th, dispatchers expected a frantic parent desperate for help. The call lasted less than a minute, yet it has been dissected endlessly. Critics claimed her tone swung oddly between hysteria and control, with moments of exaggerated pleading. Supporters countered that shock manifests unpredictably, and any attempt to map normal grief is flawed. Some analysts focused on the final seconds of the recording. A faint background noise, possibly voices, was said to contain John, Patsy, and even young Burke. To believers, this proved the boy was awake and present, contradicting the family's claim that he slept through the morning chaos. Forensic audio specialists, however, remain divided. Some hear distinct words, others hear static and nothing more. What is undeniable is the speed with which friends were summoned to the house after police arrived. By mid-morning, neighbors and ministers were walking through the crime scene. To some investigators, this looked like deliberate crowding, bringing witnesses to dilute suspicion. To others, it was simply the instinct of a grieving family seeking comfort. In the days that followed, the Ramseys granted media interviews but delayed direct police questioning. This fueled suspicion. Detectives wondered why parents of a murdered child would hesitate to cooperate fully. The Ramseys explained they feared being railroaded by hostile investigators who already viewed them as guilty. Body language experts dissected television footage, highlighting nervous gestures, long pauses, and carefully rehearsed lines. Yet modern forensic psychology warns against over-reliance on such readings. Under extreme trauma, even truthful witnesses can appear evasive. What matters is not a single gesture, but the consistency of stories over time. And here, cracks appeared. Patsy at times contradicted her earlier statements about when she discovered the ransom note. John's recollections of the basement shifted, sometimes vague, sometimes oddly precise. These inconsistencies didn't prove guilt, but they fed the perception of staging, of a family more concerned with image than clarity. While the Ramseys gave interviews, neighbors quietly provided their own observations. Several reported seeing unusual lights on in the Ramsey home late that night. Others described hearing a scream around midnight, abruptly silenced. One neighbor said she noticed the basement window appeared ajar, though she could not be certain of the timing. Individually, such reports might mean little. Collectively, they painted a picture of disturbance in a neighborhood where nights were typically calm. The scream report, in particular, has become a haunting detail. If accurate, it suggests a moment of violence before dawn that conflicts with the Ramseys' account of a quiet night until morning. Yet memory is fragile. Cognitive psychology shows that recollections, especially when repeated to media, can shift over time. What a neighbor swore 2 years may differ from what was said in the first 48 hours.
Cold case reviewers in the 2020s stress the importance of anchoring testimony to original police notes, not later recollections shaped by decades of documentaries. The central behavioral question remains, were the Ramseys staging a cover-up, or were they genuinely panicked parents caught in a nightmare? Supporters of the staging theory point to the combination of factors: the overwritten ransom note, the gathering of friends, the inconsistencies in interviews, the hesitation to cooperate. Each of these, they argue, reflects calculated image management. Defenders of the family argue the opposite, that trauma explains it all. A mother in shock might call friends instinctively. A father under pressure might misremember details. The polished media appearances could be the result of lawyers advising clients to protect themselves in an adversarial system, not evidence of guilt. Modern forensic psychology would frame it differently. Instead of asking guilty or innocent, experts analyze the function of behaviors. Was the 911 call rushed because Patsy wanted help instantly, or because she wanted to control the narrative? Were friends invited to provide emotional support or to serve as protective witnesses? Each behavior can be interpreted both ways, which is why no consensus has ever emerged. The family's 9-year-old son, Burke, was questioned multiple times. Initially shielded from the public, his interviews were later released. On camera, Burke appeared detached, even smiling at odd moments.
This fueled speculation that he was hiding knowledge. Modern child psychology, however, urges caution. Children often respond to trauma with avoidance, nervous laughter, or inappropriate affect. What looks like coldness may actually be a coping mechanism. Analysts reviewing the tapes decades later note that Burke's narrative remained consistent. He reported sleeping through the night, unaware of the chaos until the next morning. Still, critics highlight that his presence is hinted at in the disputed 9/11 background audio. If he was awake, why deny it? Was this an innocent oversight or deliberate scripting? Even with today's psychological frameworks, the ambiguity remains. Taken together, the behavioral evidence mirrors the physical and medical findings, layered, contested, impossible to resolve with certainty. The 9/11 call can be read as panic or performance. The interviews can be seen as defensive or deceptive. The neighbor's observations can be evidence of disturbance or unreliable memory. Burke's affect can be interpreted as coping or concealment. This ambiguity has kept the case alive in the public imagination. Every gesture, every word becomes a Rorschach test for guilt or innocence, reflecting the viewer's own bias more than objective truth. As we move forward, the behavioral record bleeds into the larger failures of the investigation itself. Police missteps, evidence contamination, and lost opportunities shaped how every action was judged. The very environment in which these behaviors unfolded was compromised, and that, more than anything, ensured that no single piece of evidence, physical, medical, or psychological, would ever stand beyond question. By the time investigators tried to piece together the truth, the crime scene had already slipped through their fingers. The Ramsey house was not treated like a sealed vault. It was treated like a gathering place. Friends came and went, clergy arrived, officers wandered, and evidence was altered in real time. Those first hours became a case study in what not to do, and nearly 30 years later, the consequences still cast a shadow over every attempt to interpret the evidence. The initial responding officers allowed multiple visitors into the home. By mid-morning, neighbors, friends, and even a victim's advocate were moving through rooms. Some sat in the kitchen, others walked the hallways. Every footstep risked overriding shoe impressions. Every hand that touched a doorknob risked leaving new prints. Even worse, the basement was not secured. John Ramsey was allowed to search with a friend, and it was John who ultimately discovered his daughter's body. In lifting her and carrying her upstairs, he unknowingly compromised crucial forensic detail: position, fibers, and possible trace transfer. None of this was malicious. It was the instinct of a father. But from a forensic perspective, it meant the most important scene in the house was irreparably altered before technicians could record it properly. Outside, snow covered the yard, a perfect natural surface for tracking movement. Yet officers failed to photograph or cast impressions of possible footprints before neighbors and media trampled the area. If an intruder had crossed the lawn, that proof melted away, literally and figuratively, within hours.
Inside the house, routine evidence gathering was missed. Vacuum bags, which often hold stray fibers or hair, were discarded instead of logged. Potential trace materials on bedding and clothing were not preserved. Systematically, fibers that could have tied a suspect to specific garments or rooms may have been lost forever. Each of these gaps widened the distance between certainty and speculation. In a case already clouded by an unusual ransom note and ambiguous DNA, the absence of environmental evidence meant investigators had fewer anchors to test competing theories. Over time, some objects that central remained oddly underanalyzed. The ransom note, for example, has never been comprehensively tested for touch DNA along its margins. In the 1990s, that technology didn't exist. By the time it did, concerns about contamination slowed progress. But if swabbed today, the note might still carry cells from the person who wrote it. The cords used in the basement were tested superficially, but never re-examined with the latest trace detection methods. Microscopic particles, skin flakes, sweat, environmental dust could linger inside their braided fibers. Similarly, the paintbrush fragments used in constructing the cord device were never fully explored for DNA or chemical residues that might distinguish family handling from outsider use. Forensic experts often note that unsolved cases hinge not on dramatic new evidence, but on overlooked items reanalyzed decades later. In JonBenét's case, many of those overlooked items remain boxed in storage. In 2023, Boulder authorities announced that over 2,500 pieces of evidence had been digitized into a comprehensive database. This represented millions of pages of reports, photographs, and test results. For the first time, every fiber sample, every lab note, every interview transcript could be searched and cross-referenced instantly. Digitization does not create new evidence, but it transforms how old evidence can be used. Patterns emerge when data can be layered. Fibers once dismissed as random can be linked to specific garments. Timelines can be reconstructed from scattered notes, and contradictions in witness statements can be spotted within seconds. Perhaps most importantly, digitization enables outside experts to contribute. Specialists in cold case forensics, genetic genealogy, and trace chemistry can be given controlled access to materials without physically handling fragile items. This opens the door for collaboration that was impossible in the 1990s, when every file was locked in a cabinet and every photo stored in a binder. With current tools, investigators could return to the ransom note, the cords, the tape, and the paintbrush. Swabs could be taken for touch DNA.
Adhesive layers could be analyzed for microscopic residue. Advanced spectrometry could identify chemical markers linking materials to a specific manufacturer or region. Soil particles from the basement window frame could be compared with surrounding terrain to test whether anyone actually entered that way. Even with the compromised evidence of the footprints lost in the snow, the vacuum bags discarded can still be partly recovered through secondary means. For example, early photographs may contain overlooked impressions now visible with digital enhancement. Trace fibers that migrated to police uniforms or visitors' clothing might still exist in archived materials if those garments were preserved. The tragedy of the Ramsey investigation is not only what was done, but what was left undone. Each lost footprint, each untested fiber, each discarded vacuum bag was a chance to narrow the field of suspects. Instead, every omission gave oxygen to competing theories. Was it an intruder? Was it staged by someone inside? The physical record that could have silenced one side or the other was never properly captured. And yet, hope remains. Digitization ensures that nothing else will be lost. Every item is now indexed, every photo scanned, every lab result archived. The challenge for today's investigators is to pair that record with modern science to retest, reanalyze, and squeeze meaning from the fragments that remain. The gaps in forensic collection explain why the case remains unresolved, but those gaps also fuel the optimism of modern reviews. Where the original team saw clutter, today's specialists see opportunity. And as we move into the 2020s phase of the investigation, the question becomes whether new eyes and new tools can succeed where the original search faltered. By the time the case passed its 25th anniversary, public frustration had reached a boiling point. Decades of conflicting theories had left the community exhausted.
The physical artifacts were bagged, the medical slides archived, the ransom note pored over until the letters blurred. But the file itself, the sheer bulk of it, had become almost unmanageable. Stacked across rooms, spread in dozens of storage boxes, it wasn't just a case anymore. It was a labyrinth. In 2023, the Boulder Police Department, under mounting pressure, did something unprecedented. They launched a project to convert the entire case into a digital archive. Every page of every report, every lab sheet, every photograph was scanned and indexed. The numbers were staggering. More than 1 million pages, nearly 40,000 reports, over 2,500 individual pieces of physical evidence, and more than 1,000 interviews spanning 17 states and 2 countries. For the first time, the case wasn't just paper in boxes, it was a searchable database, a system that allowed investigators to cross-reference witness statements with forensic findings in seconds. If a name appeared in a tip sheet from 1997 and again in a lab note from 2003, the software could link them instantly. If fibers collected in 1996 matched descriptions in a later analysis, the program would flag the connection. Cold case specialists praised the move as a necessary foundation. Without digital consolidation, the evidence was like puzzle pieces scattered across different rooms. Now, analysts could finally lay them out on a single table. Digitization alone wasn't enough, so Boulder PD invited the Colorado Cold Case Review Team to take a fresh look. This was not a single agency, but a coalition of seasoned detectives, forensic scientists, pathologists, prosecutors, even FBI and State Bureau consultants. Their mandate was simply to revisit everything with modern eyes, free from the baggage of the 1990s. In the group, one sashaway went unnoticed, the DNA sashaway. Contents were labeled with unknown male or male 1. Fragments distinct from any other person detected at the scene. The existence of this DNA had been known since the initial investigation, but what was done with private analytics is still a secret. In January 2025, JonBenét's father, John Ramsey, sat down with Boulder's new police chief, Stephen Redfern. It was not their first meeting with law enforcement, but by John's account, it felt different. For years, he had pleaded for authorities to adopt forensic genealogy, the technique that had unmasked killers in dozens of other cold cases. Now, with a change in leadership, he sensed openness. John brought with him private consultants, experts in genetic genealogy, who had solved decades-old cases across the country. They presented to the chief how minute fragments, skin cells, sweat traces, invisible residues had been enough in other jurisdictions to rebuild entire family trees. Their message was blunt: the technology exists. The question is whether Boulder will use it. For John, the stakes were personal and urgent. He had lived nearly 30 years carrying suspicion, enduring scrutiny, burying both a daughter and a wife. Now, in his 80s, he wanted resolution before it was too late. His appeal wasn't just for justice, but for closure, an end to the purgatory that had defined his family's life. No discussion of modern efforts can ignore L. Smith, the veteran detective who resigned from the case in 1998 after clashing with colleagues over the intruder theory. For years, Smith championed the idea that the Ramseys were innocent and that the unknown male DNA pointed to an outside offender. He built slide presentations, documented possible entry points, and even after his retirement, continued to work the case independently. Smith passed away in 2010, but his work did not.
His daughter Cindy Mara inherited boxes of his notes and continued pushing law enforcement to pursue the leads he believed had been ignored. By 2024, she was meeting with reporters and investigators, urging them to apply the latest technologies to evidence that had languished for decades. In many ways, her persistence mirrored her father's refusal to let the case slip quietly into unsolved history. The Cold Case Review Team considered Smith's materials as part of their re-examination, not as gospel, but as a record of dedicated alternative analysis. His influence lingered like a shadow, a reminder that even within law enforcement there had always been two narratives, one pointing inward to the family, another pointing outward to an intruder.
If official agencies were slow to act, the public was not. In late 2024, Netflix released Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, a three-part documentary directed by Joe Berlinger. It presented the case not as a solved whodunit, but as an open wound, highlighting missteps, overlooked evidence, and the promise of new DNA methods. The series reignited debate. Viewers flooded online forums, demanding why Boulder police had not yet applied genetic genealogy. News outlets covered John Ramsey's calls for transparency, amplifying his meeting with the new chief. Social media posts tagged officials directly, urging them to act. For investigators, media pressure can be both a burden and a tool. On one hand, it raises expectations and risks public backlash if no progress is made. On the other hand, it provides political cover when communities demand action. Agencies have more leverage to allocate resources. In Boulder's case, the Netflix spotlight coincided with the evidence digitization and cold case review, creating momentum that officials could not easily ignore. By 2025, the pieces were in place: a fully digitized database, a multidisciplinary review team, renewed advocacy from the victim's father, and a public clamoring for answers. Yet, obstacles remain. Legal restrictions on the release of DNA profiles into genealogical databases could delay or derail the process. Questions of contamination and relevance still hang over the genetic evidence. And while digitization makes connections easier to find, it does not generate new data. It merely reshuffles the old. Still, for the first time in decades, the tone has shifted. Instead of resignation, there is cautious optimism. Cold case investigators note that many recent breakthroughs came not from sudden revelations, but from dogged persistence combined with new science. The Ramsey case now fits that pattern. The groundwork is laid. What remains is the decision to act. When viewed alongside the behavioral evidence discussed earlier, the 911 call, the interviews, the neighbor statements, the cold case review adds a layer of structure. Where memory falters, databases endure. Where human recollections diverge, digital cross-referencing can highlight consistencies. The combination of psychology and data science may succeed where each failed separately. As of early 2025, the JonBenét Ramsey case is not solved, but it is no longer stagnant. The digitization project has given investigators a map, the review team has given them a compass, and John Ramsey's persistence has ensured that the case remains a priority. Forensic genealogy stands as the frontier. If the unknown male DNA truly belongs to the person responsible, then a name may finally emerge from the shadows of a family tree. If it does not, the search will continue. But one thing is certain: the cold case era has breathed new life into a story many feared would remain frozen forever. The cold case review team may have digitized every document and mapped every lead, but the heart of the Ramsey case still beats inside a battle of interpretations. Two dominant camps have defined the narrative for nearly 3 decades. Those who see the crime as staged by someone inside the house, and those convinced an intruder slipped in and left without a trace. Between these poles lies a shadow zone of hybrid theories, mixing elements of both. Each interpretation draws strength from certain pieces of evidence while struggling to explain others. From the earliest hours, detectives focused on the Ramseys themselves. The ransom note written inside the home on their stationery became the linchpin. To many investigators, it was simply too elaborate to be genuine. 3 pages long, filled with cinematic phrases and the oddly specific demand of $118,000. It seemed less like a kidnapper's rush and more like someone scripting a distraction. The lack of forced entry reinforced the suspicion. Although a basement window was technically ajar, cobwebs suggested it hadn't been recently disturbed. No snowprints were found leading to doors or grates. With no clear outsider pathway, suspicions circled back to the people who already lived there. Supporters of the family theory point to what they call controlled chaos in the home that morning. Friends were invited over almost immediately, filling the rooms before police could secure the scene. The ransom note was discovered by Patsy, but handled in ways that complicated forensic testing. John Ramsey, later searching the basement, found his daughter in a room police had already walked past. To skeptics, these actions looked less like parental panic and more like stage management, whether intentional or unconscious. Modern psychology offers nuance here. Trauma can produce disorganized behaviors that mimic staging. Parents under shock may make irrational choices, inviting friends for comfort, moving a body impulsively. But for those committed to the staging theory, every misstep still appears calculated, every inconsistency suspicious. Standing firmly opposite is the intruder theory, bolstered above all by the DNA evidence. Under the child's nails and on her underwear, technicians found a male genetic profile not belonging to any family member. Subsequent testing in 2008 reconfirmed that exclusion. For former Detective Lou Smith and many others, this was the turning point. A stranger had entered, committed the crime, and vanished, leaving only microscopic traces behind. Other clues supported the idea. The high-tech boot print in the basement, though faint, did not match any family shoe.
The presence of the garrote, a tool rarely seen in domestic crimes, suggested a perpetrator with prior criminal knowledge. Some neighbors reported strange lights, unusual sounds, or the sense of someone lurking near the property. In the intruder framework, the ransom note becomes less a family cover-up and more the work of an offender with theatrical instincts, deliberately planting misdirection. The odd phrasing, the movie references, the exaggerated threats all become signs of a manipulator seeking to confuse, not parents hiding their guilt. The challenge for this theory remains the absence of a clean entry or exit path. If an intruder came through the basement, why were the cobwebs intact? If they carried the child, how did they leave no trace in the snow outside? Modern reanalysis hopes to answer these questions with soil chemistry, digital reconstruction of footprints, and microscopic abrasion testing. For now, the intruder theory relies heavily on the trustworthiness of the DNA, that it truly came from the offender, not contamination. Between the stark poles lies a cluster of hybrid theories. Some suggest an accidental head injury within the home, followed by frantic staging to make it appear as a kidnapping. In this view, the ransom note, the garrote, and even the wiping of intimate areas were all theater, desperate attempts to redirect suspicion. Others propose that while the family may have staged certain elements, an outside predator was also involved. Perhaps an intruder harmed JonBenét and family members later altered the scene in panic. Or perhaps the DNA came from a prior unnoticed contact while the family staged a false abduction after an accidental event. Hybrid theories attempt to reconcile the insider access implied by the note and household items versus the outsider's genetic profile. They illustrate how complexity breeds complexity. When one piece doesn't fit, theorists invent bridges. Critics call these contortions speculative, but supporters argue they reflect the messy realities of real crimes. The arrival of digitized evidence and 21st-century forensics shifts the balance of these interpretations. AI handwriting analysis may soon weigh in on whether Patsy's script truly matches the ransom note. Genetic genealogy could determine whether the unknown male DNA belongs to a relative of a real offender or merely an innocent transfer. If genealogy yields a family tree leading to a known predator, the intruder theory would surge to dominance, perhaps closing the case. If, however, advanced testing reveals the DNA is manufacturing residue or lab contamination, the family theory would regain traction. Hybrid theories stand to either collapse or crystallize under new data. A confirmed outside offender would make staging far less plausible. A confirmed contamination would leave the family explanations as the only viable option. The balance hangs on a knife's edge of scientific discovery. The Ramsey case is not just about solving one crime, it has become symbolic, a benchmark by which the public judges whether cold case science truly works. If genetic genealogy, AI handwriting, digital reconstruction, and next-gen microscopy can converge on a single answer, it will send a message far beyond Boulder.
It will tell every victim's family that time does not erase truth, that evidence never truly dies if technology is allowed to grow into it. But if after all these advances the case remains unresolved, it will reinforce the fear that some crimes are too entangled, too compromised, too scarred by early mistakes to ever be undone. In the end, JonBenét's case stands as both tragedy and test. Tragedy because a child's life was cut short in circumstances still clouded by uncertainty. Test because every new forensic tool is weighed against this most public of cold cases. The ransom note gave us words, the DNA gave us whispers, the physical artifacts gave us puzzles. Now, future science may give us clarity. Whether through a genealogical hit, an AI handwriting probability, a 3D simulation of the basement, or a microscopic fiber match, the answers could finally emerge. And if they do, it will mean that even 30 years later, evidence is never truly silent. It simply waits for the right technology to make it speak.